welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of KevinMD. Rate and review the show at kevinmd.com/rate. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/follow. Today, we welcome back on the show Cindy Tsai. She's an internal medicine physician and physician coach. Her latest KevinMD article is titled Perfectionism is a Myth. Are you ready to hear the truths about perfectionism? Cindy, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back.
Now, we've had Cindy on multiple times. For those interested in hearing her story, just go to kevinmd.com/podcast. Go to the search bar, search for Cindy, and you can hear all about her story. But today, let's jump right into your most recent article about perfectionism. And certainly that is something that a lot of physicians have to deal with. So tell us the story, why you decided to write this article and walk my audience through it if they didn't get a chance to read it yet.
Sure. So for me, I've always associated myself with being a perfectionist ever since I was young, being this high achiever in high school with the yearbook superlatives. I was voted as biggest perfectionist and all these things. And I just had the idea that things had to be perfect in order to be right. And so I worked really hard, really wanting to perfect things. And then especially as I transitioned into entrepreneurship, building my business, it really gave me the opportunity to pause and really think about what is perfectionism really? And I saw that it was actually holding me back in many instances because I was spending all this time really worrying, stressing, wanting to get it right, when there's really nothing is perfect. So I think that really inspired me to share this insight with others because, especially as you say, so many other physicians also deal with this because we're such high achievers, right?
Yeah. So tell me about that contrast. I find that pretty interesting because in medicine, right, there's so much emphasis on being perfect. And right, a lot of physicians themselves, they grew up exactly like the way you describe as being perfect. But you step into the entrepreneurship world, right, where things ship with plenty of mistakes. You just look at things like Microsoft Windows. They just ship out with hundreds of bugs in them, and then they get these versions every few months to fix. And I think one of the mantras that I hear is that if something is perfect, then you probably ship too late. So it's a really different mindset when it comes to perfectionism when you contrast that entrepreneurial area with the medicine space.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that in our medical training, especially with taking the Hippocratic Oath and, wanting to do no harm, right? We think that it has to be absolutely perfect. And I think that this definitely came across more in my entrepreneurial journey, right? It's like as I'm trying different things out, marketing, sales, all these things, writing content, it's like, just do it and you learn from experience. And I think to a certain extent, we do that in medicine, right? In terms of our training, right? If we were waiting to be perfect and if we were waiting to know all the, have a full differential for every single thing, we'd probably never get through training.
Yeah.
So it's also about that sense of trust to really just dive in and to learn along the way.
So in medicine specifically, give us examples of how perfectionism holds physicians back.
Well, I think for medicine, it's a lot of times in communications with other people, whether it's with patients, with administrators, your colleagues. I saw this personally for me when I'm writing an email, or like about to reach out to a PI for research and all these things. It'd be like triple checking every single word, right? Everything, making sure like all the I's are dotted, T's are crossed. And if you think about it, that takes a lot of time, right? And that's essentially, precious time you could be using for other things. And I share an example in the article about that sense of, rewriting, rereading emails and clicking send and then realizing, oh, I had a spelling mistake or whatever. And then in that moment, you feel like this sense of doom and gloom.
Mhm,
Because
mhm.
we're like, oh no, how could you have missed it? But then in the grand scheme of things, is it really going to make or break things? Probably not. So I think that there are so many nuance, like examples in your everyday where perfectionism can seep in. And so it's just helpful to be mindful of and aware that, is it helping you or is it holding you back?
So let's talk about your story specifically. Like, how did you make that transition outside of that perfectionist mindset? Especially as a physician, like how difficult was it for you, and what are some of the steps that you took to break that mentality?
Yeah, well, I think it's a constant learning process and journey. And I think a big part was definitely having support, mentors, coaches, really working on my own mindset. I think perfectionism, especially if you've had this tendency for many years, it's probably a part of your identity. And it very much was a part of mine and, kind of is still something I have tendencies towards.
Hmm.
And so I think the big thing is really looking at it and learning different ways, tools, and techniques to shift out of that mindset and asking questions, right? Being curious about what does perfect really mean, right?
Hmm.
And that's how you can start to unravel some of those beliefs and stories that have been so deeply ingrained.
Hmm.
And then recognizing that you have control, you have choice in terms of how you want to think and proceed. And I think, especially when you're starting a business, doing something new, everything is foreign and
Hmm.
you have no idea what's going on. And so it's so important to be able to really be open to that. And because I think for me personally, especially in the beginning, wanting to get things right
Hmm.
was really holding me back because I wouldn't want to post on social media. I wouldn't want to go out networking and do things because I'm like, oh, I don't know what to say, like wanting a perfect script and
Hmm.
everything. So I think it's also just, it's a muscle, right? It's like the more
Hmm.
you do it, the easier it is. And just like learning along the way.
Now, what would be a typical physician coaching scenario? So let's say I was one of your clients and I came to you and I said, I can't, leave the office until 9 o'clock at night because my notes have to be perfect. I have to spend many hours on my note. It has to be grammatically correct. It has to list every differential like I did as a medical student. And I just can't break that habit. So if you're coaching like someone like that, which I assume would be a not uncommon scenario, what kind of things would you say to that person?
Yeah, well, I think the first step is to recognize where you are because we can't change what we don't know. And I always like to give the example of, let's say, for example, the light bulb in your attic is out, but you never go into the attic. So, how would you know that the light bulb is out? But then the moment you're like, oh, I need to grab something from the attic, and you go up to the attic and you try to turn the light on and it's not turning on, you're like, oh, something's going on here. And you switch the light bulb and then you can see again. So the same thing here. I think the first step is always to pause and acknowledge where you are, recognizing that. So in this case, it would be really seeing perfectionism as a habit
Hmm.
and really learning, recognizing that, we are basically always acting out our habits. And so the key is to develop new habits instead. And so it's a process that takes intention and practice.
Hmm.
It's like a muscle that you're strengthening, right? When you go work out. And so first step is acknowledgement and then really being curious and open about why is it that you feel the need for things to be perfect, for all the grammar, all the spelling to be right. And I find a lot of times it's because we're concerned about how things would look to other people,
Hmm.
right? It's like, oh, if I have three spelling mistakes, if I get, this wrong, other people might think I'm not competent or not good enough and all these things. And so I think it really gets back to the inner work of connecting to yourself and trusting and knowing that you are enough and that you
Hmm.
do have everything it takes. You know what what, you have the best intentions. And so I also like to bring in the idea of self-compassion and really learning to be kind to yourself and to bring that in so that you're not so hard on yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think a lot of times with perfectionists, we hold ourselves to this impossible standard. And then when things inevitably don't work out, we're so hard on ourselves and we can't, it's kind of this like negative downward spiral.
Yeah.
So self-compassion is really important to learn how to be kind to yourself. The research has shown it really helps with burnout, resiliency, all of these things too.
Yeah. So one of the truths about perfectionism that you wrote was that perfectionism will not make you happy or fulfilled. So to that point specifically, go into more detail about how perfectionism is actually a detriment to your happiness.
Yeah, so I think a lot of times we think about life and we're like, well, I just want to be happy. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And we think that, and especially with all the fairy tales, right, growing up, it's like, okay, happily ever after.
Mm-hmm.
And we think that, it looks a certain way. And I find that a lot of times we don't pause to reconsider, right? We don't give ourselves permission to change,
Mm-hmm.
to pivot. And then we kind of keep going, especially with medical training and how long it takes, right? Maybe 10 years ago you were like, I am going to be a cardiothoracic surgeon no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go through med school, you go through rotations and you're like, I really hate surgery.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But you're like, no, I can't. I told everybody I'm going to be a surgeon.
Yeah.
And, and so I think it's so much of it is just really about staying present, being mindful, right? Practicing mindfulness and just recognizing that you're here for a reason, okay? And that you are allowed to create your life the way you want it to be. And happiness comes from how you're thinking about your circumstances. I think that's really the most empowering thing about coaching, where you feel like you get to kind of create your own life, right? Instead of maybe going along with the flow or doing what you think you're supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think with perfectionism, when you feel like things have to be perfect, you are always constantly doing, overworking, overthinking, and just you always feel like it's never enough.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so when you're in that state, it's hard to be happy and satisfied and, kind of be at ease. So that's why I did put in there this idea that perfectionism will not make you happy or fulfilled. You think it might, but then
Mm-hmm.
if you really think about it, because we really don't know, like, what is perfect, and perfect is different for everybody, right? So
Right.
it's just learning to be present and really practicing gratitude in every moment.
We're talking to Cindy Tsai. She's an internal medicine physician and physician coach. Her latest KevinMD article is titled Perfectionism is a Myth. Are you ready to hear some truths about perfectionism? Cindy, so let's say I'm listening to you in this podcast and what you're saying about perfectionism resonates. What's the immediate next step, or what are some immediate next steps I should take next?
So I think the first thing is to really acknowledge yourself,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it starts with awareness and knowing that this is a good thing, because then you can choose how you want to respond, right? You don't have to kind of go on as is. And so I think, you're welcome to reach out to me, but also really being curious, as I mentioned, of just understanding, get to the root of it, of like,
Mm-hmm.
where is this coming from? Because I always like to talk about the importance of looking at the whole picture,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, yes, you might think perfectionism, you want to change it, and you maybe just start to distract yourself with maybe like scrolling on social media, eating, whatever, all these other things, because you're like, I don't want to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if you're really serious about wanting to change, really taking a moment, being present, learning to offer yourself that compassion to be like, I wonder why this is coming up. And then I choose to be kind to myself and know that I can change it and I can make it work for me. I think that's the really important message, that we're all different and the things we need are different. And, different circumstances, events are happening throughout our lives. And so I think really just knowing that nothing is permanent, right? You can always change. And yeah, reach out for connections, for help. And also, I think it's helpful to just have these conversations, right? To know that you're not alone. I think a lot of times perfectionists especially want to give this image and idea that everything is well and perfect and everything is this perfectly curated bubble. And so I think it is helpful to find connection and to get support, know that you're not alone, and know that this doesn't have to be your reality, right? If you're stressing, if you're having challenges, this is a perfect time to really work on it and to look at how you can change, develop new skills and habits to help you.
And my final question, any take-home messages that you want to leave with the KevinMD audience?
Yeah, so I think something that's interesting to think about is that perfectionism often comes from fear. And so it's the idea that, fear of not being perfect, fear of not being enough, making mistakes, being judged, and all these things. And so just recognizing that this is very common and that, it's just about really recognizing that once you see it, it's like you're shining a light on the fear, right? And then you can bring in the techniques, tools, and skills so that you can transcend and move past it. And I think it's really important, again, just going back to the self-compassion of like not being hard on yourself, right? Like we're always trying our best with what we know at that point in time, right? And like the next moment, the next minute, next hour after a podcast, book, whatever, you're like, oh, you have more insights and you would do things differently. And that's great, right? Like really trying to kind of veer away from the right or wrong, because I think a lot of times that keeps us stuck when we're like, oh my gosh, I made a terrible mistake. I failed, I'm awful, and like going down that shame spiral. So really just staying present and, developing that open-minded, curious observer state so that you can move forward and create your life the way you want to.
Cindy, thank you so much for coming back on the show and sharing your time and insight.
Thanks so much, Kevin.